I don't want her serving our table, the billionaire said quietly, but the silence that followed made it louder than a shout. The restaurant didn't stop completely, but the sound dimmed, like someone had lowered the volume on the entire room. Silverware clinking softer, conversations fading into careful whispers, and the warm amber lighting above table 12 suddenly felt colder than before. Daniel Whitmore sat upright in his tailored navy suit, his expression composed but distant, his eyes fixed not on the menu in front of him, but on the young black waitress standing a few feet away, holding 2 glasses of water with steady hands. Maya Carter had only been working at Linden and Rowe for 3 weeks, long enough to learn the rhythm of the dinner rush, the quiet hierarchy among servers, and the way certain guests carried invisible gravity around them. She recognized Daniel Whitmore immediately, not just from the hushed murmurs among staff, but from the business magazines stacked near the break room, his name often printed beneath headlines about billion-dollar acquisitions and private foundations. She also noticed the boy beside him, small and still, sitting too quietly for a child in a restaurant filled with polished marble floors and soft jazz drifting from hidden speakers. The boy's sneakers dangled inches above the floor, unmoving, his fingers lightly touching the edge of the tablecloth, as if measuring its texture rather than noticing the world around him. Maya didn't react to Daniel's request, not outwardly. She simply nodded once, her voice calm and professional as she placed the glasses gently onto the table anyway, her movements smooth and deliberate, like she had practiced staying invisible. "Your waters, sir," she said softly, her tone neutral, respectful, and steady, as if his words hadn't landed at all. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his attention toward his son. "Ethan," he said quietly, sliding the menu closer, "you should try the grilled chicken. You liked it last time." The boy didn't look up. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The overhead chandelier reflected faintly in the boy's glass, shimmering light dancing across his still face. But Ethan Whitmore remained silent, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the table, somewhere far removed from the polished elegance around him. A server passing nearby slowed slightly, sensing the tension, then moved on without stopping. Maya lingered just long enough to notice something familiar in the boy's posture, the quiet withdrawal, the careful stillness that didn't match the energy of a child his age. She had seen it before, years earlier, in a small apartment kitchen where her younger cousin used to sit the same way, listening more to the rhythm of the room than the voices inside it. The jazz music shifted, a soft piano replacing the saxophone, and the scent of seared steak drifted past as another table received their plates. Daniel leaned back slightly, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in something quieter, frustration edged with exhaustion. "Ethan," he repeated, softer now, almost like he was trying not to disturb the air between them. The boy's fingers brushed the tablecloth again, tracing a small invisible circle, and Maya noticed the movement before anyone else did. She stepped back, giving them space, but her eyes lingered for just a second longer, drawn not by curiosity, but by something instinctive, something gentle and familiar. And as she turned toward the service station, the boy's gaze shifted slightly, following the soft sound of her footsteps across the polished floor, and for the first time since they had arrived, something in the stillness began to change. The soft glow from the pendant lights stretched across the polished marble as Maya reached the service station, her fingers resting briefly on the edge of the counter while she watched table 12 from a distance that looked casual but was anything but accidental. The low hum of conversation around her blending with the muted clatter of plates sliding onto trays and the faint scent of rosemary and butter drifting from the kitchen pass. Yet her attention kept returning to the boy whose stillness felt louder than anything else in the room, and she noticed the way Ethan Whitmore sat with his shoulders slightly drawn inward, his gaze lowered not in shyness but in quiet retreat, the kind that often went unnoticed by people who expected children to fill silence with noise. And when another server brushed past her carrying a tray of sparkling water, Maya shifted slightly to allow space, her movements calm and measured, but her eyes flicked back again just as Daniel Whitmore leaned forward, his voice softer now, more careful, like he was trying not to disturb something fragile. "Ethan, look at me," he said, his tone controlled, yet edged with something that sounded like worry disguised as patience. and the boy did not respond, his fingers still tracing the same slow circle along the linen tablecloth, the overhead light reflecting faintly in the glass beside him, creating small ripples of gold across the table, and Maya recognized the pattern, the repetitive motion, the quiet focus. The subtle detachment from the environment that often signaled a child seeking calm inside a space that felt too loud even when it was not, and she felt a small pull of memory, the sound of a kitchen clock ticking in her grandmother's apartment. Her cousin Marcus sitting at the table doing the same thing with a paper napkin, folding and unfolding the corners while the world around him moved too quickly, and she inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the present as the maitre d' walked past, greeting guests near the entrance, the glass doors opening briefly to let in the cool evening air from outside. And as the door closed again, Maya noticed Ethan's head tilt slightly toward the sound of her footsteps as she moved along the floor, the polished surface reflecting the warm light beneath her shoes, and she slowed without meaning to, not stopping, just letting her movements soften, quieter, gentler, like she was adjusting to a rhythm only the boy seemed to hear, and behind her, a couple at the bar laughed softly while ice settled into crystal glasses. Yet at table 12, Daniel's posture stiffened slightly, his jaw tightening in a subtle way that suggested he had seen this before, many times, perhaps in places where expectations pressed too heavily against silence. And he exhaled slowly, reaching for his water, but his eyes never left his son, and Maya stepped to the service counter, picking up a folded linen napkin as part of her routine. Though her mind lingered on the boy's small movements, the way his foot shifted once beneath the chair, barely an inch, like a quiet signal of awareness, and as she folded the napkin once more, her gaze drifted back, and for a brief moment, Ethan's eyes lifted slightly, not fully, just enough to follow the soft motion of her hands. And the subtle shift was almost invisible, yet Maya noticed it immediately. The same way she had learned to notice small changes in tone, posture, and breath years ago, and she felt something settle quietly in her chest, not urgency, not curiosity, but a calm understanding that the silence at that table was not empty at all. It was simply waiting for the right kind of presence. And as she placed the folded napkin gently onto her tray, the faint reflection of warm light brushed across her face, and she turned once more toward table 12, unaware that the smallest change in rhythm had already begun. Daniel Whitmore adjusted his cuff slowly, the faint glimmer of his watch catching the chandelier light as he studied his son with quiet intensity, his posture composed yet guarded, like a man used to controlling outcomes, but standing in a moment he could not predict. And around them the restaurant moved with polished efficiency, servers gliding between tables, the soft murmur of conversations blending with the low jazz rhythm that drifted through the air, yet the stillness at table 12 seemed untouched by the motion, and Daniel's gaze flicked briefly toward the service station where Maya stood, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to confirm she had not disappeared from his awareness. And there was something in his expression that carried habit more than emotion, a practiced distance shaped by years of measured interactions, and he reached for the menu again, sliding it gently closer to Ethan, his voice calm and steady. "They have the pasta you liked last month," he said quietly, and the boy did not respond, his fingers now resting flat against the linen, the small repetitive motions slowing as if his attention had shifted inward, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound nearly lost beneath the soft clinking of glasses nearby, and his shoulders lowered just slightly, not in defeat but in acceptance, like this moment was familiar territory, one he had navigated many times before in conference rooms, private schools, and carefully scheduled appointments that promised progress but delivered quiet uncertainty instead. And the maitre d' passed again, offering a polite nod toward Daniel, recognizing the high-profile guest, and Daniel returned a brief acknowledgement without shifting his focus from Ethan, and across the room Maya moved toward another table, delivering a plate with gentle precision. Yet her awareness remained anchored to table 12, and she noticed Daniel's expression soften for a fraction of a second, not warmth exactly, but fatigue layered beneath composure, the kind that came from trying to solve something deeply personal with the same logic that built empires. And Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, his sneakers brushing softly against the chair leg, a faint sound that might have gone unnoticed by most. But Maya heard it as she passed by with an empty tray, and she slowed just enough to adjust her pace, the polished floor reflecting the warm glow beneath her steps, and Ethan's eyes lifted again, following the subtle movement, and Daniel caught the shift, his brows tightening slightly, not with suspicion but curiosity, and he watched as Ethan's gaze lingered toward Maya's direction, and for the first time since they arrived, Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying the small change with careful attention, and the jazz music transitioned into a slower melody, the piano notes stretching softly across the room, and Maya paused briefly at the service station, setting the tray down with quiet care, and as she reached for a folded paper slip, she noticed a blank corner of a clean napkin resting beside the register, and her fingers hovered over it for a moment, the memory of her cousin's quiet focus returning like a gentle echo, and she picked up the napkin without drawing attention, folding it once, her movements natural and unhurried. And across the room, Daniel Whitmore noticed Ethan's fingers stop tracing the tablecloth, his small hand now resting still, as if he was listening to something beyond the sound of the restaurant. And Daniel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the composed billionaire now watching not just his son, but the subtle rhythm of the room itself, sensing that something small, almost invisible, was beginning to unfold. The napkin felt light in Maya's fingers, the soft fabric catching the warm glow from the pendant lights as she folded it once more, her movements deliberate yet natural, like part of a routine she had performed countless times before, and she reached for a small pen tucked near the register, her hand steady as she drew a simple shape in the corner, a small star first, then a curved line beneath it, the design minimal but intentional, the kind of quiet visual that invited attention without demanding it, and she paused for a second, considering, before adding two more small dots beside the star, forming a gentle pattern that felt calm rather than playful. And across the room, Daniel Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair, his attention still anchored to Ethan, whose fingers remained still on the tablecloth. The boy's gaze lowered but no longer withdrawn, and Daniel noticed the subtle change, the absence of the repetitive motion that had filled the past several minutes, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice soft. "Ethan," he said again, not expecting a response but hoping for one, and the boy's eyes flickered briefly toward the sound, then drifted again toward the quiet movement near the service station, and Maya lifted the napkin onto her tray alongside a small glass of water she had already prepared, her posture calm as she approached table 12, her steps measured, the polished marble reflecting the warm tones beneath her shoes, and the ambient jazz slowed into a gentle piano progression that seemed to stretch the moment, and Daniel noticed her approach immediately, his expression tightening slightly, not with irritation but with guarded curiosity, and Maya stopped at a respectful distance from the table, her voice soft and professional. "Just a little water for him, sir," she said, her tone neutral, and Daniel nodded once, silent, watching carefully as she placed the glass near Ethan, and then, without drawing attention, she set the folded napkin gently beside it, the small star pattern facing the boy, and she stepped back without another word, her movements smooth, giving space, and Ethan's gaze lingered downward for a second before shifting slowly toward the napkin, his fingers lifting slightly from the tablecloth as if testing the air, and the faintest sound of silverware clinking nearby seemed distant compared to the quiet focus at the table, and Daniel followed his son's gaze, noticing the napkin for the first time, his brow tightening subtly, not understanding the intention but recognizing the shift in Ethan's posture, and the boy's fingers moved again, this time not tracing the linen, but hovering above the small drawn star, and Maya turned away calmly, returning toward the service station. Though her pace remained gentle, her awareness still connected to the moment behind her, and the warm lighting from the chandelier reflected softly across the table, illuminating the small drawing, and Ethan's hand lowered slowly, his fingertip brushing the corner of the napkin, and Daniel Whitmore watched in complete silence, his expression composed yet increasingly attentive, as the smallest movement began to ripple through the stillness. Ethan's fingertip rested lightly on the edge of the napkin, the small star reflecting faintly under the chandelier's warm glow, and the movement was so subtle that most people in the restaurant would not have noticed it, but Daniel Whitmore did, his eyes narrowing slightly as he leaned forward, his attention fully captured by the quiet shift in his son's posture, and Ethan's fingers moved again, tracing the curved line beneath the star, slower than before, deliberate, like he was studying. Something that made sense to him in a way the surrounding noise never did. And the gentle piano melody continued overhead, blending with the soft murmur of conversations, yet the space at table 12 seemed wrapped in its own calm silence. And Daniel's expression softened almost imperceptibly, his shoulders lowering as he watched Ethan's hand hover above the drawing. And then Ethan lifted the napkin slightly, turning it just a fraction of an inch, adjusting the angle as if aligning it with the light, and Daniel inhaled quietly, the small action registering as something meaningful, something different from the stillness that had filled the evening so far. And across the room, Maya moved slowly behind the service counter, her hands resting lightly against the polished wood, her gaze lowered respectfully, but her awareness remained anchored to the table, and she noticed Ethan's hand lift the napkin, the slight shift in his posture, the subtle tilt of his head, and she remained still, careful not to draw attention, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. And Daniel glanced briefly toward Maya, his expression thoughtful now, no longer guarded, as if he was reconsidering the quiet presence she had brought into the space. And Ethan's fingers traced the small dots beside the star, his movement careful and slow, and then his other hand reached for the glass of water, not drinking, just resting his palm against the cool surface. And Daniel's eyes widened slightly at the change, recognizing the pattern of engagement, the gentle transition from withdrawal to awareness, and he leaned forward, his voice soft, almost cautious. "Do you like that, Ethan?" he asked, not expecting an answer but holding on to the possibility. And Ethan did not speak, but his fingers tightened slightly around the napkin, and the faintest shift in his shoulders suggested attention. And Daniel's gaze remained fixed, his composure giving way to quiet hope. And nearby a server passed with a tray of plated salmon, the scent of lemon and herbs drifting softly through the air, yet neither Daniel nor Ethan seemed to notice. And Maya remained at the service station, her breathing steady, her posture calm, understanding that the silence was not empty but meaningful. And Ethan slowly placed the napkin flat again, smoothing it carefully with his palm, and Daniel watched every movement, his expression changing from controlled distance to something warmer, something closer to relief. And the piano melody softened further, the restaurant lights glowing gently against the marble floors. And in that quiet moment, the smallest gesture from a quiet child began to shift the atmosphere around them in a way that felt almost impossible to ignore. The napkin remained beneath Ethan's palm, the small star barely visible now under his fingers, and the quiet at the table deepened into something softer, something warmer, as the boy's shoulders relaxed just enough to notice. And Daniel Whitmore watched carefully, his posture no longer rigid but attentive, his eyes following every small movement like they mattered more than anything else in the room. And Ethan shifted again, this time drawing the napkin slightly closer, the fabric sliding gently across the linen tablecloth with a faint whisper that only those close enough could hear. And Daniel inhaled slowly, his hands resting loosely near the menu, resisting the urge to interrupt the moment. And the warm lighting reflected softly across the glass of water, creating small ripples of light that shimmered near Ethan's fingers. And the boy's gaze lifted slightly toward the reflection, his eyes following the gentle movement of light across the surface. And Daniel noticed the subtle focus, the calm engagement, and his expression softened further, the tightness in his jaw easing as the tension in his shoulders slowly released. And across the room, Maya stood near the service station, her posture calm, her hands folded lightly in front of her apron, allowing distance while remaining quietly aware. And she saw Ethan's fingers tap the napkin once, then again, not repetitive like before, but exploratory, testing. And she felt a small sense of recognition, the same delicate shift she had witnessed years earlier when silence turned into connection, and the piano melody overhead softened into slower notes, the ambient noise of the restaurant blending into a gentle background hum. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet. "Ethan," he said softly, not pushing, just offering presence. And the boy's fingers paused, resting still on the napkin, and then slowly, almost hesitantly, Ethan lifted the corner of the napkin and looked at the star again, his head tilting. Just slightly, and Daniel's breath caught. The moment small but meaningful, and he remained still, allowing the silence to hold. And a server passed behind Maya, carrying a tray of warm bread, the scent of butter drifting lightly through the air. Yet Maya did not move. Understanding the fragile rhythm of the moment, and Ethan's other hand reached toward the glass of water again, his fingers brushing the cool surface, and Daniel's eyes widened just slightly, noticing the coordination, the gentle curiosity, and Ethan's gaze flickered briefly across the table, then toward the space where Maya had stood moments before, and though she remained several feet away, the boy's attention seemed drawn toward her quiet presence, and Daniel followed the direction of his son's gaze, his expression thoughtful, no longer guarded, and the lights above shimmered softly across the marble floor, the restaurant continuing its elegant rhythm around them. Yet at table 12, the silence now felt alive, filled with quiet change, and Ethan lowered the napkin carefully, smoothing it once more with his palm, and Daniel Whitmore watched with quiet astonishment as the stillness that once felt heavy transformed into something gentle and hopeful, the smallest connection unfolding in the warm glow of the evening. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward slightly, his elbows hovering above the edge of the table as he watched Ethan's fingers smooth the napkin again. The small star now centered carefully in front of him, and the boy's shoulders lowered just a little more, the tension that had filled his posture earlier dissolving into a quiet calm, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest, something unexpected and unfamiliar, like a door opening in a place he had long assumed was locked, and Ethan's gaze lifted. Slowly, his eyes following the reflection of light across the glass of water before drifting again toward the service station where Maya stood, and Daniel noticed the direction immediately, his eyes tracking the same path, and he saw Maya standing quietly with her hands folded, her presence calm and unassuming, not watching directly, but aware in the way someone listens to a room rather than looks at it. And Daniel's expression softened, the earlier guarded distance replaced by thoughtful curiosity, and Ethan's fingers tapped the napkin once more, then his hand lifted slowly, hovering above the drawing as if deciding something, and the piano melody softened further, the surrounding conversations blending into a gentle murmur, and then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan's lips parted, the movement so slight that Daniel nearly missed it, and the boy's gaze remained fixed on the small star as his fingers rested beside it, and Daniel's breath slowed, his attention narrowing to the smallest detail, and Ethan's voice came quietly, barely above a whisper, soft and careful. "Star," he said, the single word fragile but clear, and Daniel froze, his eyes widening as the sound settled into the silence between them, and for a moment he did not move, did not breathe, as if afraid that any motion might break the delicate moment. And Ethan's fingers traced the star again, slower now, his voice silent, but his focus steady, and Daniel's throat tightened as he leaned forward just slightly, his voice gentle, almost reverent. "Yes, Ethan, it is a star," he replied softly, and the boy's shoulders relaxed further, his hand resting calmly beside the napkin, and across the room Maya heard the quiet word, her expression remaining composed, but her eyes softening slightly, and she lowered her gaze respectfully, allowing the father and son their moment, and Daniel glanced toward her again, this time with unmistakable recognition, the realization settling in his expression as he connected the small drawing with the quiet change unfolding before him, and Ethan lifted the napkin carefully, holding it just an inch above the table, and then he placed it back down gently, smoothing it with deliberate care, and Daniel watched with quiet astonishment, the earlier tension replaced with warmth and gratitude that he had not expected to feel, and the warm lighting from above shimmered softly across the marble floor, the restaurant continuing its calm rhythm. Yet at table 12, the silence now felt filled with something new, something hopeful, and Daniel Whitmore sat still, his expression transformed, as the smallest word from his quiet child echoed louder than anything else in the room. Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, his eyes resting on the small star, as if the quiet word had reshaped the entire evening, and the tightness in his expression softened into something warmer, something more human, and he slowly leaned back in his chair, exhaling gently as the realization settled deeper, and Ethan's fingers continued to rest near the napkin, calm, and steady. His shoulders relaxed in a way Daniel had not seen since they first walked into the restaurant, and the ambient jazz shifted into a gentle piano and violin blend, the warm lighting reflecting softly across the polished marble floor, and Daniel glanced toward Maya again, this time with a quiet intention, and he raised his hand slightly, not demanding, not authoritative, just a subtle gesture, and Maya noticed immediately, her posture composed as she approached the table with calm steps, her presence still gentle and unintrusive, and Daniel looked up at her, his voice lower than before, careful, almost respectful. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words simple but carrying weight, and Maya paused slightly, her expression calm and professional. "You are welcome, sir," she replied softly, and Daniel hesitated for a second, glancing briefly at Ethan, whose fingers remained resting near the star, and then Daniel spoke again. "He has not spoken much today," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something personal, something rarely shared in public spaces, and Maya nodded gently, her tone calm. "Sometimes quiet moments help," she said softly, and Daniel studied her for a brief moment, noticing the calm confidence in her voice, the absence of assumption, and Ethan shifted slightly, his fingers lifting once more to touch the star, and Maya's eyes softened subtly, though she kept her expression neutral, and Daniel noticed the interaction, the unspoken understanding, and he nodded once more. His posture relaxed now, no longer guarded, and the warm glow of the chandelier reflected across the table, illuminating the small drawing between them, and Maya stepped back quietly, allowing space again, and Daniel watched her move toward the service station, his expression thoughtful, and Ethan slowly slid the napkin closer to himself, holding it lightly between his fingers, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. "Do you want to keep it, Ethan?" he asked, and the boy nodded faintly, the movement small but clear, and Daniel's eyes softened further, a quiet smile forming at the corners of his mouth, and the restaurant continued its elegant rhythm around them, glasses clinking softly, conversations flowing. But at table 12 the atmosphere had changed entirely, the earlier tension replaced by calm warmth, and Daniel Whitmore rested his hands loosely on the table, his gaze shifting once more toward Maya, his expression no longer distant but quietly grateful, as the smallest act of kindness continued to unfold into something far more meaningful than he had expected. The warm glow of the chandelier settled gently over table 12 as Ethan held the napkin closer, his fingers carefully smoothing the small star, as if preserving something important, and Daniel Whitmore watched quietly, the earlier tension replaced by a calm he had not expected when they first walked into the restaurant, and the piano melody softened into slower notes that seemed to stretch the moment, and Ethan's shoulders remained relaxed, his gaze drifting between the star and the glass of water beside it, and Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands resting loosely on the table, allowing the quiet to breathe, and across the room Maya continued her work, delivering plates and refilling glasses with the same gentle rhythm. Yet the atmosphere around her felt subtly different now, and Daniel's eyes followed her movement once more, not with distance, but with quiet appreciation, and he reached for his wallet slowly, placing it beside the check folder that had just been delivered, and as Maya approached to collect empty glasses, Daniel looked up, his voice calm and sincere. "Miss Carter," he said softly, reading her name from the small tag pinned neatly to her apron, and Maya paused slightly, surprised by the personal address, her expression still composed. "Yes, sir," she replied gently, and Daniel glanced briefly at Ethan, who continued to hold the napkin, and then back at Maya. "That meant more than you probably realize," he said quietly, his tone measured but sincere, and Maya nodded lightly, her voice calm. "I am glad it helped," she answered, and Daniel hesitated for a second before sliding the check folder toward her, and inside, beneath the receipt, he had written something in careful handwriting, and Maya accepted it politely, not opening it yet, maintaining her professional composure, and Ethan lifted his head slightly at that moment, his gaze following Maya as she turned to step away, and his fingers tightened gently around the napkin, and Daniel noticed, his expression softening further, and then, almost instinctively, Ethan raised his small hand slightly, not a full wave, just a gentle lift, and Maya caught the movement as she turned, her eyes softening as she offered a quiet smile, subtle and respectful, and Ethan lowered his hand slowly, returning his attention to the star, and Daniel exhaled softly, watching the exchange, the warmth settling deeper in his chest. And as Maya reached the service station, she opened the folder discreetly, and inside, beneath the signed receipt, was a handwritten note that read, "Kindness changes more than business ever could. Thank you for tonight, Daniel Whitmore." And below it rested a generous tip, but Maya's attention lingered on the words rather than the amount, and she closed the folder gently, her posture calm, and across the room Daniel stood slowly, placing his hand lightly on Ethan's shoulder, and the boy rose quietly, still holding the napkin carefully, and together they walked toward the exit, the evening air visible through the glass doors ahead. And just before stepping outside, Daniel glanced back once more, his expression peaceful, and Maya stood quietly near the service station, returning the look with a calm nod. And as the doors opened, the cool night air slipped inside, and Ethan held the napkin close as they stepped into the soft glow of the streetlights, leaving behind a restaurant that felt just a little warmer than before.